Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well. So like I mentioned yesterday, we're going to be talking about something called postmodernism. I'm going to try to keep it relatively brief because if I really expand upon it, this is easily not only a lesson that could be several hours long, but frankly probably could be taught as its own separate course in college. So I'm going to try to keep it brief. Before we start, I have a do now for us to do. Again, the do now is really hard for me to enforce. So just if you want to pause the video, just think about it on your own, or if you just want me to guide you through it, that's okay. But if you want to stop and try this on your own first, I'd pause now. If not, just keep it going. So I want you to consider before we start, is there something that people tell you, or something that you've commonly heard that is supposed to be important, apparently, but the more you think about it, you say, no, I don't honestly think that's going to be super important. It could be something that you have yet to experience, or it could be something that you have experienced and you just don't agree with people since you have that experience. For example, a lot of you have told me that you're going to college this year. And with that in mind, the goal of this class has been to help prepare you for college, at least for the English or writing or reading parts of college. Some of you guys are not going to college, so some of the stuff that we're going over admittedly might not be as relevant. Another factor could be, for example, one thing that a lot of people like to tell people who are younger than they are is that they need to save money as soon as they can and as much money as they can, because when you get older and older and you can't work, it's harder to have a steady stream of income or money to support you in your later years. This is generally speaking pretty good advice, but some people are of a mindset that they should, to put it in certain terms, live fast and die young. So they don't really want to save, they just kind of want to spend what they have quickly. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and tell you that that's not a way to live that you shouldn't consider. It's not really my place. But the point of today is relative truth and importance. All right. So before I get into postmodernism, some of you guys mentioned last week that you had some trouble with formalism and stream of consciousness. I have put here a couple of brief explanations or descriptions. I'm not going to get into it too much, but I am going to say a couple things. Last week, I was pretty lenient in terms of how I graded your responses to the readings, especially on the first reading. If you show me you gave me some kind of effort and you put in more than just a few words for each answer, you're totally fine. If you give me a couple words, I'm taking some points off. So please keep that in mind moving forward. Put your best foot forward, or give me something relatively substantial. A couple sentences will do it if I ask for a couple sentences. Now, a lot of you guys struggle with the formalism part. I'm going to be honest. Formalism is very challenging. I didn't expect a lot of you to get it. Some of you got the hang of it well enough, and I'm happy with that. Others of you did not understand it quite as well, and that's totally fine. It is mainly a tenet for us to talk about because it forces us to consider, oh man, how do I answer this super tough question? Now, if you're really more curious about formalism than what we just covered, again, you can read the little blurb on the slide. That's totally fine with me. I did promise I'd go over stream of consciousness. It is going to become relevant to us a little later. So stream of consciousness is a way of writing that is about someone thinking or a character's thoughts, but it's not structured by punctuation or grammar or form. It's really just thought to thought to thought to thought to thought. An example is above me over here. If you have more questions about this, please let me know. But in the interest of keeping today's lesson relatively brief, I'm going to keep going. Okay, let's talk about postmodernism. Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys. This is a highly, highly complex topic. Now, modernism, I was a little less concerned about, because while modernism is fairly complex and advanced, it is relatively straightforward to the point where I could give you some of the base definitions and move on. And while I can technically screw up with postmodernism, this is where it gets challenging, because while there are some things that make postmodernism the same for all different perspectives, postmodernism is something that is wildly debated, because one group of people like to think that postmodernism means this, and some people like to say, no, postmodernism doesn't mean this, it means that, and then some people like to say it means that. And then you have about 20 different interpretations of postmodernism. All of them are somewhat technically correct, but they're all different. It's a really complex field. I'm not going to get into it too much. I'm going to cover the basics, though. So most people agree that postmodernism originally was a rejection of modernism. So the rejection of ideas that said, you know what, we have to reject traditional stuff just for the sake of keeping current. It's more of a rejection largely of anything that's organized, or anything that's categorized. A lot of people like to say, oh, if it's rejecting modernism, things that are current, it's rejecting them in favor of things in the future. Alternatively, it could be a rejection of government rules and laws, or societal norms and expectations. We'll get into that a little bit more later. But again, it is very complex, so do not get super upset if you don't understand it completely. That's totally fine. I'm going to try to cover it as simply as I can. Now, being that postmodernism is super complex, there are way too many categories for me to list all of them. I didn't even list all of modernism, but frankly, postmodernism is a little more exhausting to list. I'm going to try to narrow things down to 5 categories, and we'll see how things go from there. So the first one I'll talk about today is called the pastiche. It's essentially literature that is postmodern, or related to postmodernism, likes to combine different genres and elements to make new genres, or new kinds of writing, or new kinds of stories. Sometimes they don't fit completely well together, so you have to sort of finagle around a little bit. One example of this is when you take dark, grim, really, really bleak stuff, and you combine it with comedy to make something called black or dark comedy. Now, when I say black comedy, I don't mean comedy about black people. I mean comedy that's dark, that is grim, that is kind of depressing. While it was kind of lighter for dark comedy, technically speaking, postmodernism would describe game night as dark comedy. In fact, that's the genre that game night is filed under. Dark comedy, because, it's funny, it's got the jokes and everything, but at the same time, people's lives are at stake. People are getting shot. People are in suffering and in pain, and etc. Yada yada yada. Another example that you guys might have seen while you've been out is Tiger King. Now, I don't know if you guys have seen Tiger King. I don't know if I'm going to recommend you go see it, because frankly, it's not really something people watch because they enjoy it. It's something people watch because everyone on the show is a terrible, terrible person. That's more or less why I watched it. But in any case, technically speaking, Tiger King is a pastiche, because it has the genre and format and setting of a documentary, but it also presents the information and the interviews and the details in almost a thriller-ish or drama type way. They add the music, they present things in an order that, show different characters, and then get into how the characters fall apart, etc., etc., etc. They talk about Carol Baskin. I'm not really going to get into it, but you could technically look at Tiger King and say, you know what, this is a thriller documentary or drama documentary. There's actually a term for it. It's called docudrama. And then there are things like sci-fi, horror, etc., etc., you name it. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is something called metafiction. This is actually a really interesting concept, and you probably have seen it in some way, shape, or form in a movie or TV show, or etc., etc. Probably the best example of this is Deadpool. He's a character that acknowledges that he's a character inside a movie or a comic book or whatever. So basically, metafiction is fiction or literature that sort of pokes fun at the fact that it is a story, or it is fictional, because most stories pretend within the world that they are a real world. They don't come out and say, for the most part, oh, I'm a fake story, or I'm not real, because that kind of breaks you out of the story. But certain formats and certain stories and properties really like to capitalize on that fact. Another good example of this is The Office. It doesn't do this quite as well as Deadpool, so to speak, because throughout the show, they acknowledge that it is a documentary. So we see the story, or the supposedly real story within the world of The Office, of the characters, Jim and Dwight and Pam and Michael and Stanley and et cetera, et cetera. But it's implied that there is something not quite as genuine about it because they are on camera. They do interviews. They have mics. In fact, some of the scenes involve them messing around with the mics or making some sort of acknowledgement that it is a documentary. They kind of break character. Well, they don't really break character because they still are acting as Jim and Pam and Dwight and all the other characters, but they break character within the documentary. This is technically called breaking the fourth wall. Not so much in The Office, more in Deadpool, but generally speaking, this is something that happens. To help you understand this, I drew a little thing on the whiteboard over here. I don't know if you guys can see it. Yeah, you guys can see it. Okay, so if you look here on the whiteboard, and I'm having a little trouble seeing it. Okay, so if you look here on the whiteboard, let's say you are sitting in an audience and you're watching a play or a story on a stage. So I wrote you, obviously that's you there, you're watching, looking up at the story, and technically speaking, in a story there are 4 boxes, or 4 walls. There's the wall in the back that, contains the story, and then there are 2 walls to the side that keep the story together, but then there's a 4th wall. If you see, I drew it in a dotted line. The 4th wall is the idea of you and the characters are separated by this wall. If the wall wasn't there, then the characters could interact with you, and then there'd be very little distinction between you and the story. That would be meaning that the story would acknowledge that it is a story, and that's what the 4th wall is. Now, you won't see too much of that in postmodernist fiction, but you will see some evidence of that. Less so than the characters, and historically more so with the narrators. That the narrators will acknowledge this is a story, or something along those lines. So intertextuality is another very interesting part of postmodernism. And again, this is something you might have seen before. Essentially, intertextuality is when a story or a book or whatever media or work you're reading or watching or whatever references to some other book or work or media. You'll see it a lot in movies, especially if there's a studio that holds multiple properties. For example, Disney is really good at doing this because they own most of everything nowadays. But even when they didn't, you would see a lot of these references in old movies. For example, I put up a picture of Genie from Aladdin, and he's holding Sebastian the Crab from The Little Mermaid. They would throw in tons of things like that. In movies, you might see them more as references or pop culture points or Easter eggs. The Simpsons is another really good example of that because it constantly is taking content that exists somewhere else and it puts its own spin on it. There's actually a term for that. We're talking about parodies and satires. We'll talk about that a little more later. If a book quotes something and acknowledges that it quotes something, that's intertextuality. Technically speaking, when we read Frankenstein earlier this year, that is intertextuality because Frankenstein references tons of other books and references, such as Prometheus. Prometheus is a different story, and it makes reference to it. Sometimes the intertextuality can imply that a story that it references exists within its own universe, like a sequel acknowledging to events outside of what happens within its own story. There are tons of ways intertextuality works. Technically speaking, plagiarism is considered intertextuality, but I don't recommend you do that. It's not really considered literary etiquette, and we probably shouldn't consider it as legitimate intertextuality. Narrative variety is a weird way to phrase this next thing, but honestly, this set of ideas was so complex that I had to cut out a lot of the stuff, and this is as simple as I can make it. Narrative variety in postmodernism, especially with the literature, is when the story plays around with who is telling us the story. Whether it's a character within the story or if it's a narrator that knows everything and is reiterating that to us as the audience. It plays around with this a lot by making the narrators, if they're characters, unreliable or uncertain. If you remember from last year when we talked about The Great Gatsby, I mentioned unreliable narrators. If you're not super familiar with that concept or forgot about it from last year, please let me know. But you'll generally notice this or see signs of this when the narrator is a character, or it's through the relative perspective of a character, and the details get really shaky or foggy, or they start saying things that contradict themselves, or you just say, you know what, I just can't trust this person anymore. Another point is self-conscious narration, in which the narrator will openly admit to you, there are details you shouldn't trust. I don't know if you should trust me. In fact, a lot of postmodernist narrative variety stories start with a narrator saying, you probably shouldn't trust me with this. That is totally something that you should consider. Sometimes the third-person narrator also presents areas of shaky or foggy details. Usually it does this by writing things in the he, she, it format without, taking the specific I did this or he did that type thing. But then it'll follow one character. But then by following the character, it'll present things out of order or present details that don't make sense. That's narrative variety in postmodernism. Now, this last thing is probably the most important part of postmodernism. If we remember modernism being a rejection of traditional norms in the favor of adhering to things and updating things that are new and current, postmodernism is a critique of basically everything. It exists to reject things and do new things, but not for the sake of being current, just for the sake of rejecting and criticizing. Now, some of the things that postmodernism can criticize are very, very overt, meaning that they're very obvious. It could be a really interesting set of warped world with a really weird set of rules, and if the rules are really weird, it sort of says, you know what, we need to be criticizing how the rules in the system set up, or how people react to certain things, or how rational human nature is, that sort of stuff. It can be kind of vague, kind of small. We have to consider a couple things. How does the work examine the topic? Is it meant to be like a playful? It doesn't have to be super intense criticism. Is it like a playful criticism, or is it biting? Does it try to make fun of something, or is it trying to, really, narrow in and destroy something? Is it trying to make a small statement, or is it trying to not make a statement at all? Maybe it's just criticizing for the sake of criticizing. Now, I wrote here critical analysis. You guys know what that is by now. And I also wrote parody and satire. Some of you guys may be familiar with parody and satire, especially if you took my creative writing class last year. I'm really just putting these here as a placeholder for now. I think next week I'm going to have to dive into parody and satire even more. Because frankly, they are a really good avenue for us to sort of end postmodernism / modernism. But for now, I'm going to hold it off. I am going to talk about it more next week, though. So, a few important notes before we finish on postmodernism. Now, I'm going to stress again, postmodernism is very complex. I could not possibly cover all of postmodernism in one day. Frankly, this is a subject that could very well take up an entire semester of lessons, but I'm not going to do that because we don't have that much time. Now, one big thing about postmodernism, and this is one of the reasons that people struggle with being able to define postmodernism, is that there isn't one truth or one reality. In fact, the only reality is that there are multiple truths and realities and interpretations, and that is the way to look at things. Now, this is wildly confusing because when you really stop and think about it, the idea that reality is relative and only interpretations exist is one technical idea of reality, which kind of makes it, hypocritical, or at the very least, almost paradoxical. But I'm not going to really dive into that. That's super complex. Next, postmodernists really value pop culture. You might think that they don't because they like to reject things, but postmodernists also like to examine things and society and what people like to talk about, especially what people think is popular. And last thing I want to get into about postmodernism. Postmodernism technically exists today, but it's not really called postmodernism. It more exists in how people are very fluid with their identities, largely towards gender and race and culture and whatnot. You'll see this a lot in college, or frankly in the world outside high school. But there are, I'll give you a sillier example, although I'm sure honestly that this probably exists somewhere in the world. Let's say I told you, guys, I am not a human male anymore. I am a cat person. Now, or more specifically, I am a cat. Now, frankly, that is a wildly ridiculous statement for me to make. But by the tenets of postmodernism, you can't really tell me no, because, or rather, I can't, be forced to say no unless I decide it. Because if I interpret myself as a cat, that's my relative reality. You'll see this more with gender, and people accept this more with gender and sexual orientation and identity, and that's a little easier to accept. But I'll give you another example. Let's say, for those of you who I've told this to, I'm about 6 feet. You might have a little trouble believing it because I slouch a lot, but when I'm not slouching, I'm 6 feet. Now, let's say I told you guys I am a 12'4" giraffe. Now, by the standards of postmodernism, or by the standards of, however I choose to identify myself, and that's okay as long as I'm not hurting other people, technically speaking, that is a concept of postmodernism. Now, this gets really confusing the more we get into it, so I'm not going to dive super far into it. Just know that you will probably see it more towards gender fluidity and racial interpretation and culture interpretation and class interpretation, but technically it can exist beyond that. Okay, so here's your assignment for the week. Now, I am asking you to do a little bit more, but at the same time, I'm only asking you to read one story. Keep in mind, this is honestly not that much work. So I'm going to ask you to read The Hanging Stranger. I'm going to release it on Classroom today, and it is 13 pages. It is, frankly, not that difficult, and it's not super hard, and it is kind of interesting, although I'll be honest, I kind of prefer the Roald Dahl stuff. Now, it's interesting because The Hanging Stranger came out around the time of postmodernism. I don't know if I can call it specifically postmodernist, but at the same time, if we follow some of the tenets, it does match in with some of them fairly well. So I'm going to ask you to create and submit close reading notes for the text. I know it's been a little while since we've done close reading notes. I'm going to ask that we do it again for this assignment. 1 to 2 pages of bullets is fine. Reactions are okay. I'm not looking for something super in-depth. Just some sort of exploration of the text. And then I also want you to answer 2 questions. Of the 5 concepts I covered today in postmodernism, I want you to pick 2 of the 5, and I want you to describe how they are represented well in the story. You could talk about pastiche, you could talk about metafiction, etc., etc. Just pick 2, and then say, this is how it was used in the story, this is how it was used in the story. You need to include 1 example or quote for each of the concepts, and collectively give me 1 paragraph total for that. And then the second question is, do you feel The Hanging Stranger is postmodern or not? Or do you feel it is more modern than postmodern? That's a little more complex, so I'm going to ask you to kind of challenge yourself and explore the answer. As long as you give me something substantial and 1 paragraph, you will get credit. I'm not going to take off a lot for this because postmodernism is really challenging, but I need to see evidence that you've really given it an honest try. So again, give me close reading notes. You're going to give me 2 paragraphs, 1 paragraph for each of the questions I have here. Okay? This is due on Friday. I will release the work today, this morning, and I'll release the reading at the same time. Okay? Thank you, guys.